to set that up, I want to look at kind of a case study of Peter. And it's important that we really get the backstory. We really look at Peter here. Peter's an interesting character. We see a lot about him in the scriptures and understanding his work and his personality as he follows Christ. And he plays a huge, important part in the spreading of the gospel and all that. So he's one that I think that it's going to be very important that we get this backstory with him. I want to go ahead and read here in Matthew 26. What we're going to be talking about is Jesus has finished the first instituting the Lord's Supper prior to his arrest. And he's been preparing the disciples to get ready for this event. There's a lot for them that we see that they haven't understood a lot of things, but he's been trying to get them prepared for what's coming. And in the process of talking about that he's going to be betrayed, that he's going to be arrested, he's going to be taken away, he gets some feedback from the 12, especially here starting in verse 30. It says, "And when they had sung a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. Then Jesus said to them, 'You will all fall away because of me this night. For it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep of the flock will be scattered. But after I am raised up, I will go before you to Galilee.' And Peter," there he is, introducing Peter. "Peter answered him, 'Though they all fall away because of you, I will never fall away.' And Jesus said to him, 'Truly I tell you, this very night, before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. And Peter said to him, 'Even if I must die with you, I will not deny you.' And all the disciples said the same." So Jesus, by predicting his arrest, he's telling them, when this happens, you will all be made to stumble. You'll be scattered. You will run, basically. And Peter arrogantly and impulsively, when we understand Peter and get that, when we see in the scriptures and understand him, he's very, a strong person, impulsive, ready to go, ready to attack whatever's there. Seems to be ready to jump right in things sometimes. Sometimes he can do and say things that can almost get him into a little bit of trouble. Sometimes you have different personalities. People who, say jump in, run into that wall, they're going to run into the wall. Then you're going to have some people who are going to stop back and say, I'm going to look this and that doesn't look like it's going to be very smart to do, right? Well, sometimes Peter gets himself into some trouble once in a while. There's a lot of good in his character. Once in a while, causes him some trouble. But we see here that in replying to what Jesus said, it's like, even if everybody else over here runs, you can count on me. I'm not going anywhere. I'll die before I deny you. Which brings to a question which all falls into what we're going to get to. Have we ever been arrogant in our faith? Can we be? Can we think that as Christians in our own lives that I have this figured out? I know where I'm going. I don't have to spend time studying and growing and trying to continue on in the knowledge of Christ because I got this. I've been a Christian for a long time. And I know what I'm doing now. I understand it. Do we think we have it all figured out? Have we been really challenged in our lives as Christians? Because there will be a challenge. If you haven't been, there will be. When you will face something that will test your faith. And you better be ready for that. And I think we have to be very careful in how we view that going into it. In 1 Corinthians 10, verse 2, it says, "Therefore let him who thinks he stands take heed, lest he fall." And 2 Peter 3:17 says, "You therefore, beloved, since you know this beforehand, beware, lest you fall from your own steadfastness, being led away with the error of the wicked." We're warned to be careful to not get overconfident in our faith and ourselves. We need to humble ourselves before Christ and continue to rely on him. Or if we're not careful, we can get ourselves into trouble. This arrogance from Peter ultimately led to some serious life lessons, as it often does for us. The next step here we're going to look at is Peter's arrogant boast that we saw is challenged by Christ as he predicts Peter will actually deny him 3 times. He says, if you look down in verse 34 again, Jesus said to him, "Truly I tell you, this very night before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. But even after Jesus tells Peter this, Peter locks down even more and says, I will die before I deny you. Even after Jesus tells him this. So we must not be arrogant. In 1 John chapter 1, verses 5 through 10. 1 John 1, 5 through 10, it says, "This is the message we have heard from him and proclaim to you, that God is light, and in him is no darkness at all. If we say we have fellowship with him while we walk in darkness, we lie and do not practice the truth. But if we walk in the light as he is in the light, we have fellowship with one another, and the blood of Jesus, his Son, cleanses us from all sin. If we say we have no sin, we deceive ourselves, and the truth is not in us. If we confess our sins, he is faithful and just to forgive us our sins and to cleanse us from all unrighteousness. If we say we have not sinned, we make him a liar, and his word is not in us." So that's a warning to us. We can't think that we have it all figured out, and we have to recognize that we have sin in our lives. Because if we try to deny that, it says we make him a liar and the truth is not in us. So let's continue on. In John chapter 18, we're going to look a little more at Peter, the result of what happens to Peter when he's actually faced with the problems that he has to deal with. Because we see that Jesus was arrested and taken away. And that left all the disciples on their own. We see that they did scatter, just as Jesus said. Really, we don't know much about what they did, other than here in John 18, we see what happened with 2 of them. So, as they follow Jesus and try to get an idea of what's happening, I'm going to read starting in verse 15 of John 18. It says, "Simon Peter followed Jesus, and so did another disciple." Really, the thought of who this other disciple is really is thought to be John. So if that's the case, just because of the fact that John wrote the book and often doesn't refer to himself in first person, that's what we're going to go with. So Simon Peter followed Jesus, and so did another disciple, which appears to be John. And since that disciple, John, was known to the high priest, he entered with Jesus into the courtyard of the high priest. But Peter stood outside at the door. So the other disciple, who was known to the high priest, went out and spoke to the servant girl who kept watch at the door and brought Peter in. So that's just a little different. Of all the times I've studied about Peter and what he did at this moment, for some reason I missed that detail. That Peter wasn't alone. I just always pictured Peter just wandering out there by himself. But he wasn't by himself. He was with John. And John had some type of relationship to the high priest and those who served the high priest. They seemed to know John for whatever reason it may be, whether it's business type things or whether it's something to do with his fact that he followed Jesus. They may have recognized that he was a follower of Jesus. But either way, John had enough of a relationship that he kind of was able to come and go pretty easily. Peter was kind of on the outside of things. And so he was in a different situation than John. So it says, talking about the servant girl who kept watch at the door and brought Peter in, the servant girl at the door said to Peter, "You also are not one of this man's disciples, are you?" And he said, "I'm not." Now the servants and officers had made a charcoal fire because it was cold and they were standing and warming themselves. Peter was also with him, standing and warming himself. Now skip on down to verse 25. Now Simon Peter was standing and warming himself, and they said to him, "You're not one of his disciples now, are you?" And he denied it and said, "I am not." One of the servants of the high priest, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, and this was Malchus in the garden right when Jesus was arrested, they asked, "Did I not see you in the garden with him?" And Peter denied it again, and at once a rooster crowed. Each of these denials was, a little different. Imagine being Peter. So he went in with John, obviously was pretty uncomfortable in the situation, I can tell. John didn't say anything more about John. It's like John may have continued on to see more of the proceedings. So it kind of appears that Peter was left to himself. And that's all. Imagine how awkward that must have been in that moment. So each time that he was asked, he denied it. It even, different Gospels record a little different detail, but, he vehemently denied Christ. He said, "I don't even know him." Imagine that after what he just said. But by the third time he denied Jesus, it was interesting because somebody had recognized him from the incident in the garden. That put Peter in a different position, more to be under a type of threat, maybe to himself, because, there was something that went on, and he cut the ear off of the servant. So now he's in a bad position. Now he's in fear, even more because of that last question. And it says in some of the other Gospels that he was angry. He cursed. You could tell he caved under the pressure of that situation. And he gave in to Satan, and he denied Christ that third time. And the final straw, and this it doesn't say again in this passage, one of the other passages, the final straw to me, I think, was when Jesus looked at Peter. After he denied Christ the third time, when Jesus looked at him. Imagine what that was like. The Savior basically just turning and looking, didn't have to say a word. And Peter recognizing what he had done. Being that arrogant in the statement that he made, that he would never deny Christ, that he would die for him, and have Jesus looking at you that way. Peter realized that situation. It says he wept bitterly and went out. And what a stinging dose of reality Peter must have had. Sometimes reality can hit us hard when we realize we haven't been what we should be as Christians. Have we ever had that happen to us when all of a sudden we realize, hey, I've done something that I shouldn't have done, or I'm not doing something I should, I've said something, I realize that I haven't been what I need to be. And you realize that, just as Peter realized that he failed in front of Jesus. Matthew 10:33 says, "But whoever denies me before men, him I will also deny before my Father." That's serious business. And Peter fell into that. Hebrews 10:38 says, "Now the just shall live by faith, but if anyone draws back, my soul has no pleasure in him." We have to be careful in the lives that we live, that we don't, by the life that we live, deny Christ. I don't know if any of us, do like Peter and say to somebody, "I don't even know who Christ is." I can't imagine us doing that, but yet it's wonderful that we're not in a position like Peter. If we were threatened with our life, if we were threatened with jail time, things like that some Christians in this country may face in the future, what would we do? But just in our everyday life, do we ever deny Christ by our actions, by our attitudes, and especially if it becomes a continual part of our life? We have to be firm in our love for Christ and our service of him. James 1, verses 2 through 8. It says, "Count it all joy, brethren, when you meet trials of various kinds, for you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness. And let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask God, who gives generously to all without reproach, and it will be given him. But let him ask in faith, with no doubting. For the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea that is driven and tossed by the wind. For that person must not suppose that he will receive anything from the Lord. He is a double-minded man and unstable in all his ways." I know we're familiar with that passage, but do we find ourselves doing exactly what that says, where we don't go to God when we need to, when we might have doubt, when we're tossed around by the wind? We're asked to be strong in faith, and that's the challenge for us as we grow and live our lives. When we're faced with these situations, are we staying on course, or are we turning away from him and trying to do it ourselves? This says we're unstable and we're double-minded. So those are some things to be encouraged when we're faced with things like Peter was. But I want to move to the next section that I want to talk about, is the part that I believe is crucial for Peter. And if you think about how he dealt with it, it's crucial for us as well. It's a situation that really ultimately helped Peter get his spiritual situation back on track. So I want to go back to John chapter 21, starting in verse 1. And for time purposes, I'm not going to go through the whole passage here, but I want us to think about this situation, this scene that we see here. This is after Jesus, after his resurrection, when he comes back to make his appearances to those. And this is really, as we will see here, this is the third appearance that he's made to a group of the disciples, his closest ones. And it says here that it was Simon Peter, Thomas, Nathanael, the sons of Zebedee, James and John, and two others of his disciples were together. And they went out fishing again. And during the time that they were out fishing, someone hollers to them from the shore. And they realize that it is Jesus. And they go back to shore. First of all, before they go back to shore, they weren't having any luck trying to catch any fish. And the man on the shore says, "Try the other side of the boat." And when they do, their net is full, overflowing. Very similar. There's several things that we see in this that's very similar to what happened in previous times. They realize that it's Jesus. And then we see Peter doing something like you would expect Peter to do. He puts on his clothes, on his shirt, jumps in the water and starts swimming to shore. So there's so many of these things that we see, what that's happened before when they first were called by Jesus in Luke 5, how they were fishing, and Jesus used that to help them to see that he was who he was. Something miraculous happened. And they were going to be fishers of men. Jesus feeding the disciples. When they came back on shore, Jesus was sitting there. There was a fire and there was food. Similar to what we see with Jesus feeding the 5,000 and helping to illustrate that he is ultimately the true bread of life. Then Peter jumping out of the boat. You see what Peter did when Jesus was walking on the water, and Peter stepped out of the boat walking to Jesus before he ultimately wavered in his faith and started to sink. Very, very similar type things. It's almost like Jesus was bringing them back in, reestablishing that foundation with them to prepare them for what was upcoming. But also along with that, we see this was a time now that Jesus was going to take Peter. He was going to reconcile things with Peter and to help Peter renew his love and commitment, especially after what had happened when he denied Jesus. So this leads to a challenging discussion with Peter as they finished their meal. And things in this conversation I think we can take into our lives. Peter had some things that he had to answer to. And these kind of things that he answered to are things that we also will have to answer to. I want to skip down, is here in John 21 to verse 15. And this is where we're going to pick up the story. Verses 15 through 19. It says, when they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? And he said to him, well, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. Then he said to him, feed my lambs. Then he said to him a second time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? And he said to him, well, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. And he said to him a third time, well, he said, tend my sheep. And then he said to him a third time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? And he said to him, Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you. And Jesus said to him, feed my sheep. Truly, truly, I say to you, when you were young, you used to dress yourself and walk wherever you wanted. But when you're old, you will stretch out your hands, and another will dress you and carry you where you do not want to go. And this he said to show by what kind of death he was to glorify God. And after saying this, he said to him, follow me. Interesting conversation with Peter. Look how Jesus addressed Peter in this conversation. He called him Simon, son of John. Now, what did he end up calling Peter as he was teaching them and getting things prepared for them to be, his closest disciples? What did he ended up calling him? Peter, right? And why did he call him Peter? Because when Jesus asked, who do you say that I am? Peter is the one that said, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus said to him, upon that rock, you are Peter, which stands for rock. Upon that confession, we see that strong confession, that strong belief that ultimately led him to being referred to as Peter. But here, Jesus goes back and calls him Simon, son of John. What do you think that was? What do you think his relationship was with Jesus at that moment? He had denied Jesus 3 times. The relationship was not the same, was it? You think that got Peter's attention? He didn't call me Peter. He called me my own name. Am I back to being the old person, not Peter? Had to have had an impact. Jesus asked Peter if he loves him more than these. And that's really, I believe that's referring to the other disciples that were there sitting around that campfire and that meal. So, do you love me more than these? What did Peter arrogantly say before? He says, even if these others will deny you, I will not. I'll die before I deny you. But he compared himself to the others, didn't he? So why wouldn't you think Jesus would say, Peter, do you love me more than these? You said you did, basically. And what did you do? Peter never really answers that question, does he? He says, Lord, you know that I love you. He said that 3 times back to the Lord. He never did say, yeah, I get what you're saying. I don't love you more than they do. He never answered that question. You think he realized maybe what Jesus was getting at? As Jesus continues to ask Peter that question, you can see the increasing impact that it has on him. By the time he asked Peter that 3rd time, Peter, it says, was grieved. Imagine that conversation they were having. You know, when Jesus asked him, do you love me? How do you feel if you're in a conversation, and well, maybe maybe a little more in a conversation. Let's say who does not like to be questioned about your love for someone? Whether it's from your spouse, your family, or whatever any type of relationship you have with someone, it's when someone would question your love for them. How does that make you feel? That stings. That stings bad. Peter was asked that question 3 times. By the 3rd time Jesus asked him that question, he was upset. It was having an impact. You don't think that there's a parallel to the 3 denials that Peter had? Absolutely. Because what happened on Peter's 3rd denial? His emotions got the best of him to the point where he cursed that I don't know Jesus. It's almost like, you went this way, we're going to redo everything the opposite way to bring you back to where you need to be. The same thing. Jesus essentially reverses the denials of Peter into a reaffirmation and a recommitment by Peter to him and to prepare him for what was ahead. Because there was going to be a lot ahead. In fact, he tells Peter, this is the way you're going to die. Your hands are going to be stretched out. Another will dress you and carry you where you do not want to go. Think about who Peter was and how independent and ready to attack things, And he's going to be submissive to someone who's going to take him where he doesn't want to go. And history records that apparently Peter died of crucifixion, and it's said that he was crucified upside down because he didn't want to be crucified like his Lord. You see the transition and that Peter went through. Jesus was trying to prepare him for what was ahead, and he had to be recommitted back to doing that. Also, when Jesus asked him the question, do you love me? How did Peter respond? He said, yeah, I love you. He stated that. He professed his love for Jesus. But what was Jesus' response to that when Peter said that every time? To do something, right? Feed my lambs. Tend my sheep. Feed my sheep. It wasn't enough for Peter to just profess his love. Jesus asked him to show it by how he was going to live his life, what he was going to be doing from that moment on. Peter was not going to be equipped to go do the work that Jesus asked him to do until he was reconciled. Jesus had things for him to do. So that brings us to the question, the main question I want to get to tonight. If somebody would come, Jesus came to you and me and said, do you love me? What would be your answer? Would it be like Peter? Sure, I love you, Lord. Absolutely. But do we also show it by our actions, as Jesus asked Peter to do? We can be guilty of the same things Peter was. We can have an arrogant attitude about our love, our service, and our devotion to Christ. We can even be hypocritical in the lives that we lead. Do we show those around us that we truly love Christ? But we must still answer that question. Do you love me? Again, Peter's responses to Jesus were a profession of love. But Jesus asked him to do something. And that's the thing we have to think about. So if I ask this question to you and to me, and especially that first question that Jesus asked him, do you love me more than these? Let's say we took that question and put a blank at the end. Do you love me more than blank? What would we fill in? What would Jesus fill in that blank? What would be the thing that would be in that question to us. Peter was arrogant against his fellow disciples, and that's what he had to answer to. What's in our blank? Do you love me more than yourself? Do you love me more than your hobby? Do you love me more than your career? Do you love me more than the world? Do you love me more than these drugs that have a hold of you and are controlling you? Do you love me more than your families? Do you love me more than food? We can add a million things to that list, can't we? But can we honestly look at that and put something of our own in that? And do we find ourselves doing exactly that? Can we get caught up in something that's so fun and so enjoyable or bad for us? And can we put that higher on a pedestal than loving Jesus? That's something that we have to be honest with ourselves about. We have to be able to look in the mirror and answer that question honestly. We can see that same thing play out in the account of the rich young ruler in Matthew 19. So when Jesus said he loved this man. And he asked him, they were talking, and the rich young ruler said, I've been doing all these things to serve you from my youth. I've followed what you asked me to do, and I've done this, I've done this, I've done this. And Jesus asked him, I need you to sell all your possessions to truly serve me. I need you to sell all those to the poor. The rich young ruler couldn't do it. That was the line that was drawn that he couldn't cross. Do we have something like that? Do we have a line that we're scared to cross? That we're unwilling to give up to serve the Lord? We all have to look at ourselves and answer those questions. I get angry with myself when I find myself in situations where I've put something above him. I'm upset, I'm embarrassed with myself because I know there are times I do put things there that I shouldn't. Stuff that I enjoy. Am I taking more time to do this than spending time with the Lord? We all can put something in that blank. We all have to be willing to look at ourselves, even like the rich young ruler had to look at himself. So what does it mean, before we finish tonight, what does it mean to love Christ? What does Jesus and the Word will tell us about that? First thing I want to say is that we love Christ because of what Christ did for us, just like he asked Peter to do something and like he asked us to do something. We love him because of what he did for us. Romans 5:8 says, but God demonstrates his love toward us, that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Ephesians 5:1-2 says, therefore be imitators of God as dear children, and walk in love as Christ has also loved us, and given himself for us, an offering and a sacrifice to God for a sweet-smelling aroma. Our love for Christ should have a level of sacrifice in it. If we see what Christ has done for us, he sacrificed everything for us. I want to read in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verses 14 and 15. 2 Corinthians 5, 14 and 15. It says, for the love of Christ controls us, because we have concluded this, that one has died for all, therefore all have died. And he died for all, that those who live might no longer live for themselves, but for him who for their sake died and was raised. Because he gave himself for us. That's why that should affect us. If we really are truly affected by what Jesus has done for us, that ought to trigger the love that we have for him. And Jesus also tells us we should keep his commandments. In John 14, And then also in 1 John, both those passages are very similar. Basically, it says, Jesus says, if you love me, you'll keep my commandments. Just like he asked Peter to do something, he's asking us to do something. Does that truly show our love for him if we don't keep his commandments? If we do nothing? When he asks us to do things to show our love. And those are the things that are best for us. He asked us to keep his commandments. We're not let off the hook just by saying we love you, Lord. And Peter wasn't either. We're to walk according to his commandments. And it's very simple, really, if you look at it from Mark 12, verses 30 and 31. It says, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind and with all your strength. Is there anything else left? That's everything. And that sometimes is where we sometimes have problems, isn't it? The second is this, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. There is no other commandment greater than these. It's very simple when it's brought down to those two things. So Peter was given commandments, and we are given commandments. And we, as it just says, that we must love one another. 1 John 4 says, if you love Jesus, then we are to love our brother also. Can't do one without the other. John 15:12 says, this is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. And then also, we must not love the world. In 1 John 2, verses 15 through 17, we'll read that, and that should be our last point. 1 John 2, verses 15 through 17. Do not love the world or the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world, the desires of the flesh and the desires of the eyes and the pride of life, is not from the Father, but is from the world. And the world is passing away along with its desires, but whoever does the will of God abides forever. So what I really wanted to try to do tonight was just take a look at that question that we need to, from time to time, answer honestly with ourselves. Do you love me? And sometimes when I found myself struggling with certain things and not where I need to be, that question just rings noisy in my ear. It's like, I'm not where I need to be. And it's a tough question to have to answer. So I want to encourage us all to stand strong in God. Stand strong in serving him. Keep your faith in him and realize that he has a plan for us. He's going to be by our sides. We have nothing to fear if we trust in the Lord. To keep our faith strong. Because we see what he has done for us. So based upon Peter's experience and what Jesus teaches us about how to love and our own individual situations, again, how will we answer that question from Jesus? Do you love me? If you are a Christian and you've had problems in your service to the Lord and you have trouble with that question, you've had some things that are giving you problems, you need the prayers of the congregation, we want to give you that opportunity to ask for that. We're all here to help one another. That's why the church is here, that we can love and support one another and help each other get to heaven. If you're not a Christian, do you truly realize what Jesus has done for you? We're in this world of so much trouble. There is a God, and we will answer for our lives. But we shouldn't always have to go around living in fear, because we have a reward waiting on us. We have eternity with him in heaven. He's promised us that. So we shouldn't just come to God out of fear, though we should have a fear and respect for God. But we should realize he loved us. He thinks we're valuable. And he wants to take us home with him.